So, the shifting paleoenvironmental and historical understanding of the flow country that I mentioned on Friday is representative of wider debates concerning the interplay of human and non-human factors in the shaping of Scotland's current environment and cultural landscapes. The most contentious of these controversies concerns the degree to which the decline of Scottish woodland is a consequence of human actions as opposed to successive climatic switches and associated weather trends. From medieval to 19th century efforts to rationalise the disappearance of extensive post-glacial climax forests based on observation of layers of preserved timbers in peat bogs, to later 19th and earlier 20th century scientific understanding of the legacies of past land use practices that were hostile to woodland generation, the narrative down to the 1990s was almost entirely one of continuous decline through human agency. Central to this tradition is the myth of a lost Great Wood of Caledon, which in its developed form has Scotland swathed in a dense forest of Scots pine that blocked the advance of Rome's legions. Although already challenged by the 1860s and dismissed by academic research in the 1990s and early 2000s, the myth is resilient. It persists in popular and populist environmental literature, especially in calls for woodland restoration through large-scale rewilding, and in cynical greenwashing schemes for lost forest recreation. It is understandable that this myth persists, for it offers a modern parable for the slow violence of anthropogenic environmental degradation and possible remediation, and consequently, a form of redemption for our ancestors' crimes. While there are undoubted benefits to be taken from this putting right the wrongs of the past view in the heightened public engagement with afforestation and rewilding debates, its distorted picture of the processes that contributed to woodland decline is unhelpful in wider understanding of cultural landscapes, historic environments, and the interleaving of human and non-human agency in effecting environmental change. Most damagingly, where the myth of the Caledonian forest is deployed uncritically, the contribution of climate change to past, current, and possible future episodes of woodland loss is omitted or packaged as another aspect of anthropogenic environmental degradation. It also misrepresents the destruction of this lost forest as resulting solely from human greed, failing to recognise the conservative aspect and positive role that pre-modern woodland management had in creating many of the ecological niches we value today. It is long understood that the nature and extent of Scotland's wooded areas at the start of the period I am exploring was a much reduced shadow of the climax forests of the first 3 millennia after the last ice age ended around 11,500 years ago. The processes of woodland colonisation, climax and decline from the Mesolithic to the start of the historic era have been well researched, and there is broad agreement on trends. Human settlement and clearance for agriculture was unquestionably a factor in this decline, but the primary agency was climatic, with possible pathogen-triggered collapse of some species and episodes of prolonged cooling and increased storminess and wetness, putting stress on others at the height of the post-glacial optimum had reached the limits of their altitudinal or geographical ranges. From a maximum woodland coverage of possibly 50 to 54%, the only way was down. As conditions changed, how human populations responded had a greater impact on woodland and its regenerative capacity. Until around 2,000 years ago, it was reduced to about 25% land cover, still greater than our present 17 to 18%, but close enough to give an impression of how parts of Scotland once looked. What is also clear is that this remaining extent was nothing like the fantasy close canopy woodland of the imaginary Great Wood, but a broken mosaic of areas of denser or more open woods interspersed with scrub, wetland carr and drier heathland. Importantly, throughout Scotland, from the southern uplands to the northern and western isles, much of this mosaic was already at best semi-natural, itself a contentious term, with blocks of managed woodland reserved for the material needs of local communities. For the first of today's deep dives, I start with our earliest written record for such management, preserved in one of our most important early sources. And this is Abbot Adamnan of Iona's Vita of his monastery's late 6th century founder, Columba. Most evidence for the state of Scotland's woodland down to the 8th century comes from excavations and, in most cases, provides general pictures of wood use patterns and of wood's local availability. Thus, to have a contemporary witness to wood's functional role in the daily life of a community is priceless. Adamnan's late 7th century Life of Columba contains incidental notices of wood in the Inner Hebrides during the saint's lifetime and for how it was managed, obtained and used. A first example is an account of a miraculous grain crop sown in mid-June and harvested at the start of August, which reveals the depletion of woodland on Iona by the last quarter of the 6th century, with the monks' lordship rights on the land of neighbouring laymen instead satisfying their needs. Adamnan narrates how bundles of wattles to construct a guest house were brought by boat from the property of Finichan, a layman in the Ross of Mull. Finichan's willow or hazel coppice was not abundant, for it was in recompense for his loss that Columba's prayer gave him a miraculous grain harvest. Here we have the earliest record of woodland management as coppice, as remained the regional norm into the 1900s. Adamnan gives two further illustrations of timber shortages. Timber shortages on Iona. The first, from his own lifetime, concerns large pine and oak timbers transported overland on Mull to its west coast for shipment to Iona, for use in structural work and for boat building. He describes how the timbers were drawn behind boats and curraghs throughout the long and devious route by sea from their source to the abbey. The second story reveals that wood was also brought from the head of Loch Moidart and the inland Loch Shiel on the mainland, again towed behind curraghs from the mouth of the River Shiel. The distance involved and the dangers of a sea route round Ardnamurchan is a good indication of the absence by the last quarter of the 7th century of closer available sources of large structural timbers. A trend from availability of some wood on or near to Iona in the earlier 7th century, but a progressive decline thereafter, was borne out by excavation of the monastic vallum in the 1970s. The preserved wood from the vallum falls into two categories: turned or worked wood and its waste, and undressed twigs and branches. The former is a reminder of the use of treen in a region where poor availability of good quality clay limited ceramic production. The turned wood was almost entirely alder, and possibly obtained locally, for pollen analysis suggests a sharp decline in alder on Iona in the monastery's first phase and its recovery in later periods. Oak bumped large in worked wood remains, including posts, sill beams and planking. Oak, ash, aspen, birch, cherry, hazel, pine, willow and yew were used for stakes, pegs or pins, indicating former diversity of species available nearby, fading into need to use whatever came to hand in a district where climax woodland was long gone before 600. Pollen analysis supports this view, with evidence for oak and ash with more limited birch, hazel and willow on the sheltered east side of Iona in the later 6th and earlier 7th century, but all within continuous decline after 600. The presence of worked wood of many species in the Vallum ditch, but with low levels of pollen for all species, corroborates Adamnan's tale of timber imports. Together, the wood remains and the pollen illustrate the demand for materials in a high-status settlement and the mechanisms used to satisfy that demand. Importantly, they show coppice practice in operation for species that met everyday needs for wattling, wickerwork and wood turning, and point to the scarcity nearby of large timber species like oak or pine. The rapid 6th and 7th century decline and non-regeneration of the oak and ash woodland in the 8th or 9th centuries also illustrates initial voracious consumption of local materials, followed by later satisfaction of timber needs from neighbouring islands and mainland districts. Here we see decline of substantial woodland areas in the Inner Hebrides, consequent on climate impacts, yes, but also centuries of human exploitation. Secular sites reveal similar patterns of status, indicative use of major timbers, wattle and wickerwork in the 6th century phase of Buiston Crannog in northern Ayrshire, a massive enclosure of squared oak beams and posts with mortar joints containing a cut and trimmed alder log palisade, enclosed a house of hazel wattle and alder and hazel post construction, but with a fine plant floor of alder nailed to oak joists. Analysis of the timbers and pollen evidence for the nature of the surrounding landscape suggests that Buiston Loch was fringed by alder and willow carr managed for building materials. Further from the loch was a mixed woodland of oak and hazel, which had been exploited by the Crannog's earlier occupants. It consisted of coppice and young maiden oaks in the clearings they had created, alongside stands of mature old-growth oak standards they had left. 6th and 7th century wood use suggested changing preference for some materials over others. Willow, for example, was present, but not exploited much as building material, and also selective felling spread throughout the woodland area that avoided overexploitation of any one species. This evidences long-term sustainable management of the most valuable woodland resources through coppicing and self-seeded regeneration in areas of more intensive felling. How were relict woodlands managed where prehistoric climate change and millennia of human exploitation had removed the availability of timber for even wattle construction? The pre-660s pollen evidence from Port Mahomet presents an unfavourable picture. Tarbat Ness was largely treeless from the 5th to later 7th centuries, with scrubby, fen-loving patches developing as wetland spread after 500, with small stands of oak on drier land. Grazing cattle perhaps prevented woodland regeneration across the peninsula, so local wood demand required imports. In Easter Ross, that came probably from the extensive oak or pine woodlands in the valleys at the head of the Cromarty and Dornoch Firths. In less well-favoured places, better resource management of relict woodland was a socio-economic necessity. Excavation in the Outer Hebrides confirmed that some islands were largely treeless by the 2nd millennium BCE, with just patches of open birch hazel woodland and occasionally more species-rich blocks, oak, elm, ash, alder, surviving in sheltered locations. Where wood other than the ubiquitous heather was burned as fuel, it was trimmings, offcuts, and worn-out non-recyclable wooden artefacts. This position was unchanged in the late 1st millennium CE. At Dunvollen in South Uist, tree pollen of any species was barely detectable, but the presence of a rare pinebark beetle, a pest of a tree species absent from the Uists, suggests that, like Iona and Port Mahomet, timber was imported from distant sources. Most wood used at Dunvollen and at the early nearby pre-Norse Mound 1 settlement at Bornish was larch that reached South Uist as driftwood, as indicated by marine teredo worm boreholes. Much of the other wood at Dunvollen was hazel and alder, pointing to the persistence of relict scrub woodland management, like Finichan's trees in Mull, by the site's occupants as coppice for wicker needs. Coppice willow was also present, but the wood showed the slow growth traits of trees at the limit of their species distribution and experiencing environmental stress. Such stress could stem from drought, but more probably from the cold of the Lalia or late antique Little Ice Age. At Bornish, native species remains in the pre-Norse settlement included alder, ash, hawthorn, oak, pine and willow, some of which, the oak and pine, were probably from mainland sources. The birch roundwood remains, if from locally sourced coppice, were from trees growing in relatively stress-free conditions in contrast to the willow at Dunvollen. This type of growth speaks of sheltered locations, probably remote from the weather-exposed Macher of the Uist's western side. Here, we might have evidence for an impact of the 6th century climatic cooling, for the Wynmantarter speleothem data, which I spoke about yesterday, with its evidence for increased winter precipitation through that century, points to the dominance of wet, westerly conditions and a downward temperature trend. At Bornish, changes in wood volumes and species range present between the mainly pre-Norse settlement on Mound 1 and the Norse farms and houses of Mound 2 and Mound 3 reveal a sharp decline, perhaps through over-exploitation of a precarious resource by new settlers unfamiliar with the island's environment. The presence of juniper, a probably locally sourced wood little favoured by the previous Pictish inhabitants, suggests a scavenging approach to whatever was available, perhaps because of earlier overexploitation of other species. Through the 9th and 10th century occupation up Mound 2, the dominance of heather wood charcoal in the hearth residues, 88% of the total assemblage, emphasises dependence on moorland resources and local absence of fuel wood. Similar absence of driftwood, while perhaps signalling less arriving on nearby shores, more probably reflects tightened control over flotsam by local social leaders, and that access to such resources was tightly regulated. Collectively, this early medieval evidence points to sophisticated management mechanisms being maintained through the Lalia era and beyond, satisfying wood needs in an almost treeless environment. The breakdown of these mechanisms was probably through the loss of the traditional environmental knowledge of indigenous peoples in the upheaval of the Norse colonisation, rather than a failure of the practice itself. Moving forward into the 12th century, we again see, despite traditional views of the Middle Ages as witnessing unbridled destruction of Scotland woodland against a backdrop of natural decline, strong evidence instead for conservation of growing timber. 12th century legal theory saw trees as part of the land on which they grew. Protections, therefore, related to their status as property, and damage was a criminal act against items of real, privately owned property and prosecuted as such. On common land, including borough land, everyone with common rights could exploit woodland subject to regulations governing use. Misuse was regulated through fines. Fine levels reflected the tree's commodity value as timber and not the potential loss of wider amenity. In the various assizes attributed to Scotland's 12th century kings, neither specific property types nor commodities are named, but it is likely that popular knowledge of what was intended was based on traditional laws. The generality of property types is best illustrated in the ritualistic jingle of subject matter in charter formulae for property transactions used from the middle of the 12th century. And this is the phrase, in woods and in plain ground, in waters, outlined here on the charter in Latin, in waters, in lands, in warrens, and all the rest of it. It's a various permutations, but wood is just there in generally. Such expansive categories as this were intentionally comprehensive. Everything associated with these generalities was covered by the broad headings. A grant of woods, therefore, unless qualified by a burden or servitude, meant exclusive possession of all living and dead wood, bark, timber rights, rights to charcoal making, the fruit of the trees, both on the branch and on the ground, as well as the understory of young trees, scrubby species and herbs, and all rights to wood pasture within the land specified by the Charter. How owners exercised such rights was again subject to any specified restriction, entirely at their own discretion. Traditional wood pasture rights conflicted with exclusive control. Post-medieval accounts record wood pasture throughout the Highlands, but it is mainly from the southern uplands and eastern Highland-Lowland interface that medieval records of this practice come. Intrusion by the herds of Melrose and Dryborough Abbeys into the uplands between Weedale and Lauderdale is an oft-cited example of grazing pressures on woodland, but it is paralleled widely. For example, between 1131 and 1145, when David I gave Dunfermline Abbey Pennock near Aldern, he included grazing rights in its woodland and open ground. In the glens of north-east Perthshire, Malcolm IV gave Cooper Angus grazing rights in the forest of Drimmy, north of Blairgowrie, provided that livestock returned to the monk's property nightly. Walter, son of Alan, gave Paisley Abbey pasture in his forest for cattle and pigs, alongside his and his tenants' own herds. This last case highlights the multiple, overlapping and conflicting rights in wood pasture beyond the potential clash with hunting interests that were produced by the interplay of ownership, tenancies and gifts of easement rights in the same resource. A recurring feature of forest pasture wars was pannage rights, from the Latin panagium, the name of the payment charged for autumn mast grazing by pigs, later extended to the process of grazing itself, relating to the fattening of pigs on acorns. Our earliest surviving records indicate that it was well established by the late 1000s and probably for centuries previously. It is, for example, possible that the name Swinewood for a property listed in a charter of King Edgar dated circa 1100 to the monks of Coldingham reflect its use as a pig grazing area since the arrival of the first English-speaking settlers locally in the 7th century. By the second quarter of the 12th century, multiple references to pannage reveal that mature oak woodland was exploited routinely for fattening pigs on calorie-rich acorns prior to slaughtering in November. One acorn contains, on average, 144 kilocalories. So don't eat it. Grants of pannage in forests in Lothian, at Traquair, Selkirk and between Gala and Leader, in Drimmy and Cluny in eastern Perthshire and near Elgin, Forres and Inverness, in the woods of the Stuart Lordship of Renfrew and the lands of the Lords of Galloway between Ur and Nith point to this being an almost ubiquitous woodland resource. By the 1200s, however, references to pannage were fossilised relics in reconfirmation charters, and by the second half of the 13th century, on royal properties, fees were collected only in the Forest of Selkirk. The decline of pig numbers in Scottish oakwoods in the 1200s is so general as to be suggestive of recognition of the impact of these destructive foragers on a resource which was coming under intense pressure from other forms of exploitation. With only mature oaks of 50 years and older producing acorns, felling of young growth trees for wood means and animal grazing destroying seeds and seedlings left a dwindling number of old growth veterans. One unanswerable question in this respect, posed where it is evident everywhere from Iceland to the Ardennes, is were pigs deliberately employed as agents for land clearance? Woodland clearance for agricultural purposes, called assarting, was in progress throughout this period. We see it in the Forth Basin from the Trossachs to the southern Ochils in the early 1000s, marked by the spread of Gart place names, Gart Navel and all that. Gaelic Gart or Gort, a field of standing corn, a garth, a cultivated plot. And it spread through the area from around Drimmen and Aberfoyle in the west to Clickmannon in the east. In Clickmannonshire, Gart sites included locations of tree felling operations for those granted access for timber and firewood in royal forest there. Elsewhere, pollen evidence suggests fresh intakes from scrubland that had regenerated in previous centuries and containment of remaining woodland zones. Along the northern rim of the Cheviot Hills, for example, such evidence highlights scrub woodland cover, mainly of willow, hazel, birch and alder, contracting into dispersed and heavily managed copses in the valley bottoms and isolated upland stands, enclosed to protect them from grazing animals. In the Western Highlands, Glenafric saw a similar trend, with woodland patches persisting amid areas of dispersed arable cultivation, valley bottom meadow, rough grazing and peaty wetland, even at the peak of the medieval climate anomaly, or MCA, and reflecting retention of informally managed areas for the wood needs of local communities. In upland context, therefore, we see conservation of remaining woodland resources being introduced between the 10th and the 13th centuries. Clearance in this era can be traced throughout southern Scotland in both charters and pollen records. Felling was related to the more benign conditions of the MCA, which encouraged efforts to bring more land into incentive agricultural use, and more wood and wood-related products were consumed. Pressure for pastures, arable land and their products spurred encroachment into wood and scrubland, with woodland reduced to ribbons of trees separating blocks of cleared ground. We saw this yesterday between Gala and Leader, where the wood which divides the clearing of Colmsley from a certain other clearing was acquired by Melrose for further clearance. In this denuded landscape, possession of remaining trees was fiercely contested. At Colmsley, the King's Forester attempted to prevent further encroachment on one dwindling area to give cover for deer under his oversight. Melrose, however, saw this as desirable pasture and claimed access to the disputed woodland, which by the later 1170s was appropriately named Threepwood, from the Scots threep equaling argument, contention, dispute. Rather than a free-for-all of destructive exploitation, such cases expose a more complex picture. Analysis of place names and charter terminology for woodland of different types and purposes reveal sophisticated management systems behind the conflicts. What the records preserve is that system breaking down under population pressures and overlapping and conflicting wood use rights. Amongst the clearest evidence is management for underwood. The spindly, rapid-growth shoots produced when young trees of timber-producing species, like oak and elm, are cut or grazed, the resulting slender stems being ideal for poles and rods. This coppicing forms a woodland of a few tall trees reserved for timber by the property's lord, with an extensive underwood available either through easement rights, where tenants had assured access to the wood for fuel and materials, or through leases. The underwood, however, was also managed, coppiced on a rolling basis of 5 to 20 years to allow recovery and new growth. Recovery required protection where there was grazing livestock, and references to portions of wood in defence refer to enclosed sections or hags to keep animals out. How sustainable were these practices? Scotland's medieval population would not have understood modern concepts of conscious sustainability, but they would have understood the need to ensure that there were adequate future supplies of the right types of wood for all needs. It is probably in this context that we should see the survival in the highlands of small woods, like in Glen Affric, where trees on patches of better quality land disappeared, like here in Glen Affric, in the later Middle Ages. In such places, however, population never reached the levels of the Lothians, where lords juggled multiple demands on the same resources. Furthermore, what seemed like an absence of careful management evident in the inroads made into woodlands for fuelwood purposes might instead be evidence for how regulated access delivered unintended and undesirable outcomes. Coppicing of young trees to promote underwood growth alongside reservation of a few large, mature trees appears to deliver sustainability. But the young growth wood is reproductively immature, and diminishing numbers of seed-bearing old-growth trees long-term delivered a decline in woodland regeneration. The eventual loss of the mature trees tipped the balance towards young-growth underwood and a shift overall to scrubby woodland formation. Despite increasing 12th century litigation involving woodland and woodland rights, however, it was not yet thought necessary to legislate to protect trees specifically. Although we lack evidence for any woodland policy as such, that does not mean there were no political concerns for it. Anxieties had emerged by the early 1200s in the boroughs, arising from shortages of building material and firewood as urban expansion saw demand outstrip the capacity of common resources to supply them. Around 1209 to 12, several boroughs secured new charters that expanded their legal rights and economic privileges. The best known, granted to Perth in 1209, contained a new clause to encourage traders to bring timber and firewood for sale. Wood was the only commodity identified so specifically in any borough charter of this period, and it suggests that communities saw protection of timber suppliers as an essential extension of their economic privileges. They well understood that threat to their well-being posed by wood shortages. Articulation of legal safeguards for trees in the early decades of the Little Ice Age provides the launching point for my third deep dive, which explores mounting concern after 1400 for the economic impact of timber shortages. But the first legislative responses occurred in the 1420s, by when most East Coast ports were importing sawn Estland boards of eastern Baltic oak long before the deteriorating weather of the early Little Ice Age could have become a limiter on woodland regeneration, seems to support traditional views of decline attributable to past anthropogenic mismanagement rather than to environmental factors. The new laws show little development in thinking. It was a continuing issue of supply of wood and theft or destruction of a private commodity that was legislated for, not any provision of a remedy through conservation or planting. In King James I's March 1425 Parliament, 2 acts addressed aspects of wood thefts, the texts are up there, suggesting perceptions of a newly significant problem of the pillaging of growing woodland. The intention of these acts was to empower lords to protect their resource and secure compensation. It was a reactive remedy for a perceived ill, not a proactive solution for shortages driving illicit encroachment. It was another generation before the question of planting to address dependence on imports and confront the problem of illegal felling was addressed. In 1458, the first legislation in Britain designed to encourage tree planting was enacted here. Its date might not be purely providential, for it was by the 1450s that the suppression of tree growth that had commenced with exceptionally cold and wet conditions in the 1430s became evident. Although clear in intention, like the 1425 Act, it avoided prescription of how to implement a policy. It stated simply that all freeholders, when granting new leases, had to require tenants to, quote, plant woods and trees and make hedges and sow broom after the quantity of their mailings in places convenient, end quote. There was no clarity as to required extents of planting or where to plant, other than it was in some way proportionate to the size or value of their property holding and in places within it that were convenient. Convenient for what is not defined, but we should assume that it was on land not otherwise given over to another productive use and best located for the benefit of the occupants of the property. The only reference to enforcement was that the landholder could apply such pain and unlaw as they shall modify to tenants who failed to plant. The fruits of those powers were the incentive on the landowner's part to apply the Act rigorously and on the tenant's part to comply. What effect had the 1458 Act in practice? Although not referred to specifically, there is a correlation between the enactment and the appearance from the 1460s in leases of specific tree planting requirements on tenants. At Cooperangus, leases of June 1468 stipulated that the Abbey's tenant at Aberbothry, Cotyards and Cooper Grange in Strathmore was to plant ash trees and osiers or willows. By 1472, there was explicit reference to this requirement for tree planting as being an ordinance of the Abbot's court. At the same date, the Abbey's leases began to require tenants to provide the trees with haning and defence, indicating that contrary to the 1450 Act, plants had remained unenclosed and suffered through grazing or illicit woodcutting. The monks valued their wood at Campsie, on the Tay 11 kilometres southwest of their abbey. Yet here, a 1474 lease permitted their tenants to graze an unlimited number of cattle in part of the woods, if only without damage to the wood, as it said. A new lease in 1483, however, instructed that Campsie Wood be cleared of cattle, which hints that the earlier injunction had been fruitless. It emerges, however, that the wood was already enclosed by a wall, with tenant access being regulated by lease terms. In 1483, tenants were required to erect walls around half of the wooded area. Now, these walls may not have been entirely of stone. For 2 kilometres from the Abbey precinct at Keithick, the monks' 1472 lease required hawthorn planting to form hanings, following the 1458 Act's terms. At Middledrimmy, the tenant was to put the land to all policy efter had power, that is to say, in biggin and plantation of trees, eshes, oyers, and soch, with hanings and defence. At Cotyard, in 1473, in addition to trees, the tenants had to plant broom parks, a second stipulation of the 1458 Act, and orchards with haning and defensures of the said plantations. Although it was in the 16th century that the lamentations of the kingdom's rulers concerning timber shortages reached a peak of shrill anxiety, the 15th century legislation exposes concern over continuing decline of domestic woodland. Stripped of rhetoric, the legislation responded to long-term progressive loss of mainly large timber-producing trees as opposed to coppice. Here we glimpse that unforeseen outcome of centuries of coppice management that had seen woodland in lowland districts, and probably much of the highlands too, reduced to blocks of smallwood coppice with isolated mature standards that produced the seeds for regeneration. As those standards aged, died, or were felled, with most of the remaining trees having growth of less than 25 to 50 years, the reproductive or regenerative capacity of the woodland became increasingly precarious, worsened by the poor climate conditions in which few tree seeds set and where seedlings and saplings were vulnerable to weather extremes. Mature trees also experienced increased damage, and widespread woodland loss arose from more frequent and intense storms after the early 1400s. Summer storms, when the trees were in full leaf and waterlogged soils loosened root systems, that had a greater impact than winter events. The greatest casualties were trees of seed-producing age, further diminishing the regenerative capacity of woodland. In areas where there was already limited growing timber, such as the southeastern borders, parts of Lothian and Fife, one solution was to create parks. Viewed traditionally as enclosures for deer, for sport, most were as, if not more, important as preserves for timber, wood pasture and fodder. One such was the park at Falkland in Fife, developed by King James II from 1451 onwards. There, in 1458-9, just after the enactment of his planting legislation, he ordered the enclosure of Falkland's wards and woods. The coincidence of the development of this reserve and the recorded need for timber to be brought in for construction at its castle points to these enclosures being for future local supply of large timbers. 16th century references to hags and recorded deliveries of fuel wood to the castle at Falkland in the 1470s, however, suggest that what existed was coppice and may have included fast-growing species like alder and hazel as well as oak. Now, James II was not alone in planting, as the Douglases' Park at Dalkeith and the Hamiltons' Park at Cajow illustrates. At Cajow, trees dated dendrochronologically to around 1444 were planted on abandoned rig and furrow cultivation, illustrating emparkment of former arable in the emptier post-plague landscape. At Dalkeith, massive coppice stools with later and now fully mature growth indicate that its oaks were managed from much, much earlier, but worked through the 15th century and beyond. Based on this record of attempted regulation, conservation and protection, traditional representation of the later Middle Ages as a free-for-all in woodland clearance are too bleak. Instead, contemporary climate impact worsened the effects of centuries of steadily mounting human pressures. Together, they provided the stimulus for a tree planting, conservation and protection policy. Moving to the final period for discussion, I will consider evidence for woodland management between 1500 and 1700. As with earlier centuries, woodland condition had been used as a measure of the scale of environmental change, habitat loss, and general ecological health in this period. That our record evidence often presents a negative picture has led to a long historiographical and romantic tradition of this period as the nadir for Scotland's woodland. A sequence of legislation to protect trees and encourage new planting, litigation in pursuit of illegal felling, barking and peeling of bark for tanning, proclaims the continuing pressure on woodland. Accounts of both increasing imports or the securing of wood from central or northern highland locations further conveys a sense of deepening anxiety in Scotland's rulers at the continuing inroads on and poor management of the remaining woodland within their realm. They also appear to underline the ineffectiveness of earlier legislation and the inability of both local and national jurisdictions to stem the tide of loss. The lamenting tone of James IV's March 1504 Parliamentary Act, which describes how the woods of Scotland are utterly destroyed, however, has both conditioned historical perception of later legislation and has also become a touchstone for modern calls for reforestation. Here, it seems, is historical proof positive for the depth of anthropogenic impacts. The Act's language, however, is recognised by historians as a rhetorical flourish to contextualise the proposed legislation, and the Act itself is understood as more representative of royal frustration at the lack of the large and expensive timbers needed for royal construction projects than the state of the nation's woods in reality. Shortage of in-demand trees closest to the areas of highest usage does not mean their absence everywhere, and nor does it mean that other species and forms of timber management were absent. Multiple records contemporary with this lament for Scotland's wasted forest reveal woodland's large presence. Where then were those woods? Knowledge of areas of exploitable woodland in the central, southern and western highlands was not new. What was not well understood, except to local residents, until later in the 16th century, however, was its physical extent and diverse composition. A major advance in this knowledge came with Scotland's first systematic mapping project, undertaken by Timothy Pont between circa 1583 and 1614. It has been observed that there is a possible correlation between Pont's survey and the passing of parliamentary legislation in 1609 for ironworking sites in Highland districts using charcoal from, quote, certain woods in the Highlands, which woods by reason of the savageness of the inhabitants thereabout were either unknown or at the least unprofitable and unused, end quote. Lowland authorities had awoken to the economic potential of this resource and stepped in to control its future exploitation before private interests did. The intervention of Crown officers was driven by a wish to regulate development and to profit from that regulation, not to conserve the trees. Woodland around Lochmaree is often seen as typifying the outcome of unregulated commercial exploitation, linked to the intrusion of industry into the Highlands. Most accounts begin with Sir George Hay, who secured a commission in 1610 to make iron and glass anywhere in Scotland, and in 1611 bought a 31-year woodland lease on the Mackenzie estates in Wester Ross. 20 years earlier, Pont depicted and described Mackenzie lands around Lochmaree as clothed in richly diverse woods, and this is the text. These, according to traditional narratives, were devastated by Hay's workmen in little over a decade after 1611. In his lease, Hay secured rights to most species, defined as all oaks, one cutting only, pine, leaving sufficient trees for Mackenzie to build his galleys, ash, elm and aspen, half of the birch, hazel, holly and lesser trees. By 1624, it was reported to Hay that his furnace had ceased operation as the remaining woods were inadequate for fuel. How much of this apparently catastrophic decline is attributable to the furnace operations is debated, but by the time a final attempt at iron making ended in the 1660s, the woodland had been transformed. Hay's lease terms show that what Pont described was no wildwood. The stipulation of a single felling of oak and retention of pines from Mackenzie's galleys indicates rolling coppice management of oak and conservation of pine for lordly use. Given the wood management practices we have seen since the 7th century, it is also likely that the other species were coppiced or managed on a felling and regeneration basis long before 1600. New wood supply agreements made in the 1620s also show coppice management throughout the Mackenzie lands. Collectively, whilst not conclusive, this record suggests that these woods were long subject to human exploitation, and the impact of charcoal manufacturing and timber operations here in the 1600s converted managed old-growth woodland into secondary growth. Loss of older established trees exposed coppice and naturally seeded regeneration to uncontrolled grazing, especially as there is no evidence for haning. Consequently, the woodland extent was reduced and became more fragmented. But while the nature of the woods was transformed due to these operations, it was not wholly lost. Indeed, substantial woodland with high-quality timber was identified here in the 1700s, and a biodiverse woodland still surrounds the loch today. We can see from Pont and the activities of speculators like Hay that the apocalyptic tone of James IV Act was hyperbole. Neither Highland lords nor their officers would have recognised in the coppice management that existed on their lands the kind of destruction and failure of regeneration that have been read into this Act's words. While misleading for the Highlands, however, James's language was very appropriate for lowland districts, where depletion continued despite his 1504 Act. To counter that, fresh legislation in 1535 sought to provide a clear exposition of the, quote, policy to be had within the realm, end quote, in respect of planting trees and woods, making of hedges, orchards, yards, and showing of broom. Going far beyond the 1458 Act, it required everyone with land valued at £100 and over per annum, where there were no woods or forests, to plant and enclose 3 acres or more with trees and hedges in places most suitable. Landlords were now to take personal action and plant rather than offloading responsibility onto their tenants. Under the 1535 Act, landlords retained coercive powers, being empowered to enforce planting on tenanted land. Failure to comply, however, was judged against the lord, not the tenant, with a pro rata fine of £10, with the norm being a £100 land, imposed for each failure. Again, unlike 1458, this Act established monitoring processes, empowering the king to make annual inquests into compliance and ordering all men to begin planting immediately to address chronic timber shortages in areas with the highest timber demands. One remarkable record of the annual scale of timber consumption at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries concerns the Earl of Huntly's dispute with his tenants, the Grants of Fruchy, over woods in Strathan in the northeastern Cairngorms. Documents from the late 1580s and early 1610s list buildings within the townships of the central area of the Gordon-Strathan lordship, noting the number of roof couples in each and expressing as trees the volume of wood required for maintenance and renewal. The 7-year rolling total of 781,685 trees is breathtaking, even when we understand the Scots term tree here as meaning a coppice shoot. It is a staggering record of voracious timber consumption by peasant communities. The systematised coppicing of birch, hazel, willow and alder to meet that need, and the apportionment and regulation of community access to these resources by a landlord's agent. The litigation which generated the surveys recorded regulated felling, coppicing and replanting, an active pursuit of transgressors. This conflict occurred at a time when climatic deterioration was altering woodland growing conditions across Europe and affecting even Scotland's heavily managed woodland. The records narrate the consequences of human choices made in the context of a supply crisis and how human agency interacting with environmental change delivered unforeseen outcomes, both negative and positive, that affected land management regimes into the 18th century. As a coda, it should be added that Pont's contemporary map of Strathan shows no woodland in this part of the glen, and that's from before this litigation. Unfortunately, we lack his text description of this district, so we have no sense of how wooded or denuded the valley was. By way of contrast, Robert Gordon of Straloch, his early 17th century map of Strathan, developed from Pont's sketches and notes, embellished by William Jans and Jan Blau, show the glen upstream of Dalvorer as wooded, with areas of trees even around Loch Ann here and in greater density around Loch Bulg in the heart of the Cairngorms. Prima facie, Pont's map supports Huntly's claim that the Grants' mismanagement had devastated the woodland resource. Gordon's map, however, implies a valley rich, actually cloaked in woodland, but Pont, Gordon and the Blows had different priorities in what they depicted, with Pont much more interested in recording settlement than trees, and the others exaggerating the extent of tree cover too, as Chris Smouth points out, fill bleak empty spaces with a little more interest. If we add the witness of John Farquharson's 1703 map of the Forest of Mar, his emptiness around Loch Ann and Loch Bulg, while the woods of Glenmore are marked, suggests Gordon and the Blows had infilled these areas decoratively with trees. Neither map, then, is a perfect rendering of reality, and we must rely on assessment of what underlies our written record. Claims of woodland loss were exaggerated by Huntley to strengthen his efforts to expel the grants. In conjunction with Pont's map, however, the documents have been read at face value and linked by modern observers to the present treeless character of the Upper Glen as evidence of past mismanagement. Woodland loss in Strathann has been widespread, even if the density suggested by Gordon's mapping is of doubted reliability. But most loss occurred either millennia before Huntley's litigation or through increased deer pressure in the more recent past. Cartographic sources are valuable and can strengthen inferences built on paleoenvironmental evidence. Pont is, despite the previous caveat, our single most important source of data from this period. Many Pont maps are lost, but material reworked from his originals by Gordon of Straloch and his son James Gordon of Rothieme formed the basis for comprehensive mapping in the mid-1600s by the Blow brothers. Bearing in mind the previous caveat about filling in gaps between Pont, the Gordons and the Blows, we can visualise approximate locations, nature and extent of Scotland's woodlands in a 50-year period from the 1590s to the 1640s. None showed the Highlands clothed in a vast wildwood. Pont and the Gordons show instead that Highland woodland was a patchy mosaic, extensive in some places but generally broken into small, isolated blocks, far in character from the blanket of closed canopy, glen-filling woodland popularised by early ecologists. If we take just Pont's map of the forest of Atholl, we see exactly this character of woodland in the upper reaches of Glengarry and its tributaries, densest further from the settlements and penetrating the deep-cut stream courses feeding into the river valley, but with straggles of trees flanking the river as far south and east as Blair Atholl. These flanking woods are ancestors of the birch woodland we can see today by the A9 at Tulloch near Blair Atholl to past Dallen Torwenia, but the denser woods he depicted north of Dalnacardoch and Dalnaspidal are long gone. So, in conclusion, by 1700, native woodland in some districts was nearing its lowest ebb, but in others only experienced its first sharp decline in extent in the following century. Pressure on woods through assaults by peasant farmers in lowland districts had eased since the mid-17th century, but even in the mid-18th, woodland loss continued, albeit at a diminishing rate, despite a general shift to woodland protection and plantation by the greater landlords. At the same time, different pressures emerged in highland areas, where commercial interest first in oak developed rapidly in the early 1700s, bringing greater intensification of exploitation than had occurred under traditional management regimes. Pulses of felling and regeneration characterise the experience of the region and provide some of the most memorable anecdotes of the devastating impacts of commercial exploitation on native woodland. But it was not simply a story of unthinking and wanton unsustainable practice triumphing over traditional methods, for most of the new exploiters were acutely aware that the resource they were felling was finite and, if mismanaged, fragile. Despite Frank Fraser Darling's graphic portrayal of the rapacity of the commercial ventures of charcoal burners and iron masters with interests in highland woodlands, most had long-term plans intending to be invested in infrastructure that underscore their intention to be not just fly-by-night asset strippers, continuing the millennia-long interplay of human and climatic factors that brought Scotland to their lowest ebb. They were there for the long term, and they needed trees. Thank you.